afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Rodriguez. I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, To Telehealth or Not to Telehealth, Supporting Child and Adolescent Mental Health Providers. My name is Jim Rodriguez, and I'm joined by Nicole Lee and Daniel Tan. I'll be introducing them in a little while. Before we get started, though, I'd like to just make a few notes to orient everyone. Please note that when you join the webinar, you've been placed on mute. Probably all know that by now to avoid any background noises. If you come across any technical issues, please chat into the host who will be able to assist you. And you'll have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation through the chat box feature, and just chat those in. We are going to have ample opportunities for the audience to interact or to give their thoughts and impressions about some of the topics that we're going to be addressing today as we go along as well. So again, chat in any questions that you have that you may want to address at the end of the presentation as well. And please, we always sort of appreciate the feedback that you give. So at the end of this webinar, you'll get a survey to fill out, and please give us any your thoughts and feedback on the webinar, but also any thoughts that you have around future offerings. Just for folks to know, everything that we have, the recording of this webinar, as well as the slides and other information that might be helpful to you all, will be available on the CTAC website within 2 to 3 business days. So with all that said, we're going to begin today's session, today's webinar. Just really quick, an agenda, we're going to start with a brief overview of the benefits and challenges of telehealth. And then we're going to have a discussion of some areas of consideration for shared decision-making on telehealth. And then we're going to review some care scenarios with our presenters and with you, the audience, and we're going to discuss some examples from the field to apply some of these areas of consideration to your work. And so, of course, we all know that the pandemic opened up the option for telehealth. For some folks, it may have been something that many folks hoped for years, and it can also be something that many folks dreaded coming. Folks may lie on the spectrum of sort of acceptability or concerns about telehealth. And so what we hope to do today is have some discussion about how to navigate through those challenges as they occur. Very quickly, this is just some research showing the trends in telehealth use through the pandemic, including sort of general outpatient visits, but also the share of outpatient behavioral health visits across different ages, looking at children, adults, and older adults. And you can see these trends continue. I would say that sort of we don't have current data, but some of the current data that's available out there is showing that in 2020, there were 21 million outpatient visits. Just to be clear, that was all outpatient visits, including for health and mental health care and behavioral health care. 21 million. In 2021, there were 24.2 million outpatient visits, telehealth visits. And in 2022, just last year, as we're sort of coming back to normal, 27.6 million. So all that to say is that it looks like telehealth is here to stay. We should also point out that the science, however, especially in the area of mental health and behavioral health for children in particular, is very light. So the studies that are available show that telehealth can be as effective and as efficient as in-person, and in some cases more so. But our thought is that sort of we still need to look at the research, and hopefully that will be coming in years to come. And then just some of the benefits of telehealth. Some of these may be obvious, but of course, increased access to care, not needing to travel to and from services, being able to take those services and see folks from home and other places. More ease in scheduling for clients who are busy or struggle to make time during quote unquote normal business hours. More availability during crisis situations. And more opportunities for face-to-face contacts possibly during those crisis situations. And then, of course, comfortable settings for participants, doing it in the places where people feel safest and most comfortable, that sometimes may be outside of the office. Greater consistency of care, providing more opportunities for constant contact. And then, of course, comfortable with technology. Obviously, that is not for everyone, but certainly the younger generation is more comfortable with technology, and it can fit the needs, especially of younger people. Now, while it may seem that everyone in the world is connected, from many of our perspectives, seeing everyone out there with smartphones and other devices, it may seem, but the reality is that there is and does exist a digital divide. So 79% of Americans use the internet, right? In our minds, sometimes it may feel like 100%, but people with limited income and education are less likely to use or understand the internet. 75% of upper income households use the internet versus 30% of lower income households. 48% of households without a high school diploma do not use the internet. And half of non-users identify cost and lack of skills as primary barriers. So all of this to say is that if telehealth is an option and continues to be an option, we have to be mindful that the digital divide and the degree to which structural inequalities can lead to inequitable provision of services is always present. And that's present as well in in-person visits. So we always have to be mindful of the degree to which interventions and our approaches meet the needs of everyone that we serve. And so, our two presenters today, Nicole Lee and Daniel Tan, we've worked closely with them. They've worked closely with us, I should say, in providing us some ideas about what are the areas of consideration as you're making decisions about telehealth, about healthcare generally, but also about the use of telehealth versus in-person versus, community care. And so they've given us and shared with us their thoughts about what are some of the things we all need to be considering as we look at the possibility of telehealth versus other modes of providing services. And these are some of the things that they shared with us. Access, of course, being number one. The degree to which the approach gives itself to active participation in care. Privacy and confidentiality, of course, being aware of how we create protected spaces for effective communication and collaboration, of course, while sort of looking at self-disclosure and concerns and the preferences of individuals. And of course, all of this complicated when we're talking about not only meeting the needs of young people who we work with, we're going to be primarily talking today about young people, children, youth, and families, and parents and caregivers. So oftentimes these can differ within child and family services. And then, of course, safety. What are the mutually acceptable levels of risk at this stage of work or at any stage of work, and how they can be beneficial for overall treatment? And then, of course, assessment. To what degree does telehealth impact assessment? What are the emerging needs and presenting problems, and which areas of assessment require priority? What are the modes of assessment? And then lastly, intervention. What kinds of tools and service delivery models would promote effective intervention strategies and ongoing engagement? So how does telehealth impact treatment? And then going back again to ensuring that whatever approach we take to delivering services, that they be equitable. So and these are some additional considerations. So cultural considerations. Has telehealth been explored in partnership with the parent and caregiver and youth with respect to their beliefs and attitudes about care? And that could be sort of related to a person's cultural background, ethnic background, race, religion, ethnic group, gender, sexual orientation, but often generally, right, the preferences people have around in-person contacts and telehealth generally, and just distance. So in addition to that, clinical presentation, the degree to which the child or youth is experiencing any neurological, behavioral, or psychiatric symptoms that can interfere with or be exacerbated by remote technology. Things like auditory processing impairment, inability to attend, and extreme impulsivity. And then lastly, cognitive and developmental functioning. Does the child and youth, as well as the parents and caregivers, have the developmental capacity to participate through available telehealth means? So there's a lot of things to take into consideration And today, our presenters today, as I said, who helped us put together those areas of consideration, also have a good deal of experience with telehealth and dealing with the many sort of vagaries and navigating some of these considerations in their work. Nicole Lee is an LCSW. She's currently manager of contracts with Vibrant Emotional Health, but prior to that, she worked as the director of child and family services at the Henry Street Settlement, looking at in the outpatient mental health program serving survivors of gender-based violence, and also the director of domestic violence programs at Henry Street Settlement. Daniel Tan is currently Mick Silvers, our own assistant director of learning innovation. Before joining us, he was a team leader in On Track New York, working with young people with early onset psychosis, and he's also worked in PROS programs and ACT programs. And so I want to bring Nicole and Dan in and have a conversation. And I just want to start by asking you just a couple of quick questions in terms of your experience with telehealth. What were your initial general impressions about telehealth before all this hit? What did you think about telehealth? And then, based on your impressions and experiences through the pandemic and now, how have your thoughts about telehealth changed over time? How did you feel, before and during and after the pandemic? So Nicole, if you could start us off.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Welcome all. Happy to be here. Good to see some familiar names as well. So yeah, I think pre-pandemic, telehealth was definitely an inevitability. I think I could see the writing on the wall that it was starting to become a more of a just an integral part of mental health services and provision. I think it can be just as effective as in-person work with the appropriate training and with being able to apply it effectively. And I think, with COVID, that being part of the new normal just got accelerated. And so I think just having it kind of be forced and part of the landscape so that we can actually continue to provide services during the pandemic when we couldn't physically be together, just made it happen a lot faster than it would have happened otherwise. And I was already using it in my private practice, especially with teens and adults. But with the pandemic, I was forced in my nonprofit agency work and in my private practice to really try it with younger age kids and with families. And I think it takes a certain level of kind of assessment of like how appropriate is it and how do you really determine if it's going to be effective. And that's kind of why we're here today to talk through that. And I wish this talk had existed, these considerations existed when the pandemic hit. That's kind of when we were developing all of this. I was saying I wish we had this in 2019, right, for fortune telling, but I wish we had it back then. And I'll throw it to Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Hi, y'all. Thanks, Nicole, for pitching it back over to me. As someone who's done a lot of field and community-based work, office work, telehealth as well, I really did not always want to do telehealth. I think like Nicole, before the pandemic started, I did have some biases and assumptions about it. And honestly, for myself, I shut myself off from even considering it. And of course, when the pandemic hit and there was this heightened desire to prevent death and disability, pivoting to telehealth was so critical to supporting the folks I was working with alongside my interdisciplinary care team. And so as a director and a clinician of the program, what I had hoped we could really accomplish was to be really creative and attuned to the needs of our youth and families as much as possible, really given strengths and challenges of telehealth. And what I think we did was that we fully embraced it, which is something that I don't think is really easy. We created a virtual waiting room, virtual offices, a virtual way of being a team. And we actually ended up being the program that used Zoom the most in the entire agency. And we thought about what to budget for if people needed access to the technology. And we sought support and resources that could connect us to the resource we couldn't get for that first year. And we advocated for and budgeted for items in subsequent years, given that we wanted to prioritize access to this modality of care. And guess what? Almost 100% of the youth and families loved it. I will say though, as a team that did both office work and field work, what emerged was the idea that telehealth was its own thing, right? Similar to how doing office sessions and home visits are so different, telehealth is so different. It's not simply that translating office work to a virtual setting is so easy, in the same way that community-based work is not simply translating office work to the home or to the park. And we all needed to develop more skills, knowledge, and awareness to do telehealth well. I'm sure some of the folks out there can relate to even the concept of silence in person versus on telehealth. And there's such diversity of possibilities to really consider as we work to really embrace telehealth alongside or in lieu of other modalities.
Thank you, Dan. And I think in many ways, as we have this discussion, even though we titled this telehealth or not telehealth, what kind of is becoming more clear is that it's probably that's not the best way of sort of approaching it. We're approaching it for the sake of a discussion today, but it seems to me that oftentimes there's going to be some hybrid form of services, and trying to figure out how to combine those in the way that best meet the needs of children, youth, and families is the challenge. So what we wanted to do now is to sort of review some care scenarios. Dan and Nicole have shared some of their experiences with telehealth, and we're going to share them with you to sort of think about how to apply those considerations for care to specific care scenarios. So we're going to go through these, and what we want to do is ask you all to participate as well. So as we go through these scenarios, I'm going to ask each of the presenters, Dan and Nicole, to give their initial responses to it. So the scenario that we're looking at right now is one that a young person that Nicole worked with. Dan is going to respond with his thoughts, but we also want the audience, you, the audience, to respond with your thoughts, your impressions about these areas of consideration and what comes up for you. So in this first care scenario, Angela, she's a 5-year-old girl who witnessed physical violence between her mother and father. The family lives about an hour away by train to the clinic. The family does have an iPad that the child could use for virtual sessions. And in the first session, she presented as easily distractible and unable to maintain engagement in the virtual platform. And so just want to turn it over to Dan and as well our audience to give your thoughts as you look at these obviously this very brief description of Angela. What are some thoughts that come up in your mind with regards to these 5 areas that we're talking about? So Dan, if you want to start us off, and I'll be looking at the chat and seeing what folks have to say from the audience.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear what people have to say. So thanks for pitching it back to me. The first thing that comes to mind is really safety. What are the levels of risk at this stage? I'm thinking about how there's been physical violence that was witnessed. Is that happening at the home? Who lives at home? How is Angela impacted by such family dynamics? This also makes me think about privacy and confidentiality. Is there space for communication and collaboration for me to work with Angela? I'd want to be able to assess well the needs and presenting problems in a way that can respect Angela's needs in a developmentally appropriate way and with safety in mind. Would that be something I can do on the iPad? Is the Wi-Fi great? Are there secure connection features available? If we do the office, how does the commute affect access, right? What's that experience like? So if we also think about interventions, how would I deliver services effectively given Angela's current abilities to focus and engage in telehealth versus in the office versus, even thinking about a home visit. So that's what I would think about if I'm considering to telehealth or not.
Okay. And Nicole, and I think, of course, for me, that the first thing that pops out is that first bullet, of course, and there being violence in the home. So all of the things that you talked about kind of apply here. Nicole, so tell us, how did things work out with Angela?
Sure. Yeah. So I totally hear safety as the top concern, and to share with everyone, actually the perpetrator, the abuser, didn't live at the home anymore, and so that was it. We were able to easily or quickly kind of resolve that. Wasn't a concern in terms of safety in the physical space, although that was part of the assessment and making sure that both Angela and her mom were safe, and ongoing safety planning around that. but with her being 5, and with the commute of an hour, which was not super desirable for mom to navigate, we did attempt to do some virtual sessions. We, as any 5-year-old should, she was very active and very energetic and actually really engaged, but because of where she was developmentally and because of her just accessibility around staying on the iPad, staying within shot of the camera, not accidentally ending the call, which happened a lot. It really presented a challenge in terms of it being an appropriate way to intervene. And so we attempted a few sessions that way. I reconnected with mom around that, this is presenting a little bit more of a challenge than even though she's able to be on the screen, maybe and watching a show or playing a game, doing therapy that way wasn't really effective. And so we did explore her being able to commit to coming in on a weekly basis and doing in-person therapy with myself. Unfortunately, because of the commute and because of scheduling conflicts, that ultimately wasn't a possibility for mom. And so we referred her to a clinic closer to her part of the city. And she started working in person with another therapist closer to home. I think another consideration, had I been at an agency that offered this as an option, doing home visits, I think that could have been a way to kind of, have another option on the table in terms of a way to intervene. Unfortunately, where I was at the time, that wasn't an approved intervention type, so I couldn't go into the home. I actually do that for my home visits, or to do that for my private practice. I do home visits, and I've worked other agencies where I know that can be on the table. So going back to what Jim said about hybrid could also include, in the community work, could also include, virtual and in-person somewhere services. So yeah, so that's how it all. So and I think that going to the 5 areas, really looking, the areas that came out for us were access, just the technological access for a 5-year-old, and access to the physical space for mom. Just being able to commute that distance was not feasible. And then intervention, if she's 5, virtual sessions were just not effective, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so we had her connected to the right place so she could continue her work.
Now, with that, Nicole, just a quick question for you, as well as the audience and anyone too. When I first saw this scenario, my thought, in addition to the safety issue, also was around her age. So there's 2 things, and just clinically, one of the things that I also wonder about is, the distractibility and the ease. And this is getting real deep into the clinical space, but just wondering, a 5-year-old girl who's experienced domestic violence in the home, home can feel like an unsafe place, right? Just from the history, home could be a trigger. So some of the distractibility, I'm just curious, and I know it might be difficult to assess this, but was it ADHD or distractibility, just developmentally 5-year-olds being difficult to maintain concentration, or was it the trauma? And just for the audience as well, does anyone have good examples or experiences with working with 5-year-old children where telehealth did work?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm seeing Kristen's comment too about joint, like dyadic work with TFCBT or PCIT or CPP. And I was working at a place, I'm not trained in CPP, I'm trained in TFCBT. Yeah, that's definitely an option to consider and to explore. With the distractibility of Angela, we also faced just kind of confidentiality challenges, which can happen with any age, really, just making sure the parent can set up a space for the child to have confidential space and time. And that was a challenge for Angela's mom too, just because of their trauma history. Like, she really wanted to be involved and be aware, and she was hypervigilant. So it was actually really important to get her to a space where she could be contained and be separated from mom, to have that kind of therapeutic space, and to assess like what would be the appropriate sort of intervention, to Kristen's point about other modalities for those younger age range. That's a great point.
And I want to thank Kristen Fortuna, who's sort of chatting in that she's done parent-child sessions, TFCBT and PCIT and CPP virtually with 3 to 7-year-olds. So I just want to highlight that, and thank you, Kristen, for sharing that. It's not always the case, right? There are scenarios which a 5-year-old exposed to domestic violence might benefit from virtual visits. So it's not a rule out that because she's 5 years old, that we should rule out telehealth. And this gets at the reason why we're doing this, right? It becomes a little bit more the strategies and the approach. take a lot more into consideration. And Emma Devoto says definitely safety issues, young child privacy in telehealth can be other people around, as this was violence in the same home. Yeah, so right, those are some of the issues to keep in mind. And I think as we move forward in this work, just generally, we'll find out more about some of these connections to setting and the degree to which those make sense with regards to these areas of consideration.
Yeah, and Emma also pointed out maybe mom needs therapy too, and that was part of the work as well. So thank you for noting that. That was definitely part of my engagement with the whole family and with Angela and with mom. So
great. Thank you for sharing, folks. We're going to move to the next scenario. This scenario was, and I see some other remarks come in, and I'll circle back to them, but this scenario, I'm just going to, this is someone that Dan worked with, a young person that Dan worked with, an 18-year-old woman of color living with a single parent who had multiple hospitalizations due to unusual thoughts and hearing voices. There was a need for a comprehensive assessment to develop plans to address her needs. And then initially there was a recommendation for 2 to 3 visits per week. So large number of visits, but many missed in-person appointments. So turning it over to you, Nicole, what are your initial thoughts as you see these areas and how they apply to our areas of consideration?
yeah, so what comes up for me is thinking about, first I see her age, I'm thinking like young adult, I'm thinking, you know, wanting autonomy, wanting space. She's with a single parent, lives with a single parent. So I'm kind of wondering, what does that look like? What does the home environment look like? Can she have confidential space there? And then looking at the clinical presentations, you know, how acute are her current symptoms? She's got some unusual thoughts and hearing voices. So we're looking at some psychosis. She's been in the hospital before. So how effective might a virtual versus in-person intervention be? And then jumping to the having missed some in-person appointments and maybe that being a barrier, you know, thinking about how to increase, you know, attendance, increase engagement, especially with that recommendation of 2 to 3 visits per week, you know, of knowing someone's got attendance as a barrier or traveling as a barrier of in-person meeting in the community is difficult. How to really set them up for success, to really meet the treatment recommendations and help them on their journey. Yeah, so that's what jumps out to me. I will throw it to Dan, or maybe get some comments in the chat that we can field.
I really love seeing the chat box and seeing people really think alongside you, Nicole. And, you know, I think this is going to be hopefully a helpful example to help people really understand the work that can be done through telehealth. So, you know, Portia, she is someone who's very persistent in her personal goals. She loves sports. She had tremendous honesty about her own preferences in care and also her own perceived barriers to success. You know, her thoughts that she experienced that seemed unusual to others were part of some of those barriers. She also heard voices that were telling her what to do and were highly critical of her. And of course, the medical model would refer to these as delusions and hallucinations. She was also in college previously, but discontinued it due to some of these experiences. But she was able to eventually secure a job. We did highlight this educational stuff as something we continue to work on with her, given that further education and training were part of her desire, but she was not confident in being able to do so. She didn't have a history of unusual thoughts about technology and surveillance related to telehealth equipment, which would have caused concern regarding telehealth use. In addition to family support, vocational support, and therapy that was offered by my interdisciplinary team, she eventually found medication that works for her, clozapine, after a few hospitalizations and partnership with her team about her definitions of recovery. And clozapine, if you didn't know, requires weekly, biweekly, and then monthly labs, and initially required lots of support around it. But she was eventually able to manage it on her own pretty much independently. And we had wanted high levels of assessment to provide proper crisis intervention and response strategies based on varying levels of monitoring her needs, resources, and her overall situation. And at times, those 2 to 3 visits per week were part of the beginning of our journey with her to support those crisis prevention strategies with constant assessment and monitoring, since we were all on the outpatient side of care. And so when we think about this level of focus on safety, assessment, and intervention based on such considerations, we wanted access and engagement as priorities, and we were able to decrease the frequency of visits to weekly once concerns were reduced, and she was able to consistently engage in hobbies and pursue and maintain employment. So I will have to say, though, that there were lots of missed appointments in person at the office, and when we did try to do home visits, those were really declined frequently, and was challenging for us both on the phone and in person to engage with the parent, given the family's differing priorities. So when we did telehealth, however, there was an increased success in appointments, and I was able to assess my own skill level and my team members' skill levels, and we were able to understand ours and the family's mutually acceptable levels of risk at this stage to understand how can that level of risk be beneficial for us to hold in considering overall treatment. So when we did do telehealth, we were able to quickly respond to any potential crises rapidly. So for example, at some point, she became someone I rarely needed to worry about. But at a critical point in her life, when transitions caused stress, she discontinued taking medications. And so I was able to quickly connect with her, and it was easier for her to agree to having frequent meetings because she just had to sign on to Zoom from her bedroom. And over weeks and months, through constant assessment, I saw emerging warning signs, and at times was able to have her bring the parent into the picture because they were in the room next door working from home. And I personally had to make sure that I and the team understood their schedules to ensure that I would schedule appointments at times when I could loop the parent in, even if the parent didn't expect to be looped in. So I needed to create opportunities for flexible family involvement as key to my planning. And so when concerns were picking up and the warning signs went into crisis indicators, telehealth got me to work with her to agree to go to the hospital, where we were able to partner with her and the parent on when to go, how to go, where to go, what to say and do. And on the day of the hospitalization of telehealth, I was able to stay on camera with her until everything was ready for them to go via car service. So we avoided even use of the ambulance. I was even able to loop in another important person into the session via telehealth, and I was able to follow up on the phone as well as with the hospital and the family throughout the entire ordeal, from the start of my original plan session to the time they arrived at the emergency room. So it really worked out.
Thank you, Dan. Any other, and I'm just curious, Dan, so it does sound it does sound like your work with Portia went almost exclusively telehealth. I mean, were there in-person
Yeah,
contacts?
we started in person,
Right.
of course, and then in person was a bigger struggle, a much bigger
Yeah.
struggle than when we did telehealth. And when the pandemic happened and we all pivoted, she also embraced it. And we're just like, wow, we're getting to know her more than the year that we had her. When it was not the pandemic and when we didn't have access to telehealth, even though we were trying to do office visits and home visits. And so
Right.
this third option really, really increased access and also allowed us to actually better accurately assess for safety and deliver interventions that included the entire family.
Gotcha. And I not to make it sound like the pandemic was anything, but it almost sounds like that telehealth definitely did benefit her indirectly, and what happened through the pandemic created an option that might not have been there before. Great example. Emma says her age helps a little as she's young adult, obviously easily access if she would like telehealth, and will offer privacy, crisis intervention, and something that will help would be trust in the therapy too. And it sounds like some of that trust was built through those telehealth contacts as well. It was, and in many ways actually strengthened through the telehealth contact.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because she was someone who was very honest with us. Like, I don't know if I want to do the whole session today. And like, okay, instead of 45 minutes, we're gonna go with 30 minutes. All right. Or okay, you don't want to talk to me. Let's think about how to negotiate our frequency while still making it so that we can mutually support you in achieving your goals. There was a lot of that kind of stuff, which is very typical with adolescents and young adults for us to think about as well.
Thank you, Dan. Emma, I see your question. I'm actually going to circle back to that question, or have Dan and Nicole answer that question, possibly through the next two scenarios. So Emma has the question: how do you do good engagement in the beginning of telehealth. So rather than answer that right now, Nicole and Dan, maybe you can sort of address that in your next two examples, and or when we come back at the end. Make sense? Okay. So the next care scenario, again, we're going to go back to Nicole. Nicole worked with Kareem. Kareem is a 13-year-old boy referred to due to increasing behavioral concerns at school. He resides at home in a domestic violence shelter with multiple families, little privacy in the shelter, and the therapist is unavailable on the days when the youth is available. Right, very common challenge there alone. So Dan, your thoughts? What pops out at you for this scenario?
Kareem. Okay, so for me, the first thing that comes to mind is privacy. Can we create a protected space for effective communication and collaboration while tending to self-disclosure concerns and preferences? I'm not sure if that's possible at a shelter. I would personally consider doing a community visit to the shelter based on that, or have them come into the office. I would also think about access, what's promoting or hindering participation in care. I'm not 100% certain at this point what are Kareem's preferences and his barriers, but what I do know is that I might be limited in my ability to assess and provide proper interventions if access and privacy aren't prioritized. So at the same time, safety is always on my mind. And so if he is in a DV shelter, how is the environment there contributing to or taking away from any risk and safety concerns? Is doing anything regarding therapy and telehealth from within the shelter going to be beneficial for him versus doing it somewhere else? It might be better, for example, if I could meet at the school, given behavioral concerns. Could I even ask to telehealth or not, depending on technology resources at the shelter? Are there other places that could be safe and offer privacy and confidentiality? I just need to assess further before jumping to any kind of decision about it.
Great. So Nicole, and again, this theme of the setting is becoming an interesting one as we go through this in trauma and domestic violence. And so Nicole, tell us about what happened with Kareem and me.
Yeah, so with Kareem, actually in this role, I was, or in this scenario, I was a supervisor, so I wasn't working directly with Kareem, but I had the ability to be creative with the therapist and think through how could we really meet Kareem where he was and what his needs were. And so the initial attempt was for a therapy to be provided at an outpatient clinic. And that was where the availability piece for sessions was really a challenge. On top of it being the height of the pandemic. So people were very nervous about being in person, even though at the time we were in person, we were running a shelter. So the services were still happening. And so we got creative internally at the DV shelter. He was in a space with another family. So his family had one bedroom, and then the other bedroom was designated to another family. So there was literally no space in the home in the shelter for him to have any privacy other than the bathroom, which there's one bathroom to two families, a total of like 8 people, I think. So it was not ideal, nor do we want to have therapy while a child's sitting in the bathroom. What we were able to do was a pretty unique situation where we found a space that was unused. We had assessed that Kareem was old enough and mature enough and could be trusted to kind of sit in a space by himself, while the therapist had via a screen in a different space. So we couldn't have them in the same room together at the time. We were trying to avoid that, but we had this space where Kareem could sit and be logged in on a computer, and then the therapist from our shelter staff, actually a youth social worker, logged in from a different space, their office, and did therapy via telehealth a few feet, like not even 100 feet apart, like they're on the same compound in the same space, but getting really creative in being able to give him space and privacy and confidentiality, and make sure he had that access because he had been through so much trauma. And just being in the shelter is a very trying, very challenging experience for any young people or any family. So confidentiality and privacy were able to be secured through that very creative process. And I'm wondering, I kind of wanted to go back to your question, Emma, about good engagement at the beginning. I think especially when we think about just switching between telehealth or in person, that it's just the same. It's the same thing, but just on a screen. And I think that's such a misconception. It's so much different to be engaged through 2 dimensions rather than 3 dimensions. Like Dan was saying, like just even having silence and feeling that silence with the person you're working with. I think it takes a lot more rapport and engagement building skills than in-person work. So I think it can be as effective with those kinds of skills and being able to really engage and find ways to pull in the client, the child that you're working with.
Thank you, Nicole. I do see that, again, we are getting questions in, but some of these questions I'm going to circle back at the end and address some of these broader questions. So we'll come back to them, folks. Julie, I see your questions about working with middle school children. I just wanted to, just a quick note, just to be clear with folks, all of these are pseudonyms, so they're not the actual names of the young person that Dan and Nicole worked with. So we're going to circle back to these questions, I promise you. We're going to go to the last scenario, and then we'll come back for Q&A. But thank you all for the questions. So this last scenario is Cisco. Again, this is a young person that Dan worked with. This is a transition age youth who's living alone, utilizes SSI and SNAP, challenged by cooking and maintaining a clean space, does not work and discontinued pursuit of higher education, thoughts about others being against him, and no desire to leave his home. And I think this is one of those tricky issues, right? So telehealth and no desire to leave the home. To what degree does that kind of reinforce that, and how do you work through that, as well as others? Nicole, let me turn it back to you, though. So your thoughts about this scenario and what it brings up for you.
Sure. Yeah. So I go right to the age. I'm thinking, yeah, Cisco's living alone. He's transition age. He's a young adult. There are some limitations. There's some challenges in terms of keeping up with his activities of daily living. He's having a hard time cooking or keeping a clean space in his apartment or his space. Looks like there's just limited engagement with the outside world. Like he's not working. He's not pursuing anything in terms of education at this current time. And he's got, that probably is informed by his fears or his thoughts about others being against him, some paranoia there clinically. And he doesn't want to leave home. So I'm just kind of like, I want to meet him where he's at. I kind of think, I wonder if like telehealth could be a way to start. If there isn't concerns about, technology access, or if he doesn't have the resources to be able to have an iPad or a computer to log in. And yeah, just hearing his preference to stay at home, but then how to kind of build towards maybe, in-person work. So I'm excited to hear what Dan did with Cisco.
Thank you. Cisco, he did start college at some point, and then discontinued it. There's a history of multiple hospitalizations, thoughts about others being against him. He had worries about himself not doing well if he pursued his goals. He did leave the house actually, but then not without a parent. And so before the pandemic, we did meet in person, but it wasn't always regularly. And at times we had to meet in the community. He does, however, have really great family support. His one of his parents always got him food, and he is very interested in proper food habits and has hobbies like gaming. So he eventually did find medication that was helpful for him based on his own preferences, but he continued to have worries about leaving the house, along with a high level of rigidity about different possibilities in life and in his own abilities. Lots of difficulties of experiencing any kind of perceived discomfort, anxiety about really taking on new challenges and being in new environments. And so he didn't work or attend school at the start of the pandemic, but with the possibilities of remote schooling, we actually ended up helping him restart his educational journey at one point online. And additionally, given concerns about telehealth perhaps not working because it would keep him within the home, which I think many people would understand to seemingly worsen anxiety and social isolation concerns. But in considering the appropriate intervention, what kind of tools and service delivery models would promote effective strategies and ongoing engagement, right? So what would help him clinically, but still help him to engage with us and not miss visits? So eventually what we did was we came up with a plan to do exposures via telehealth. So at this point, we already helped him with some of his needs related to housing and food and whatnot. But we started creating a plan to do exposures via telehealth where he had a phone that he could use to make telehealth easy to access from anywhere. So we started with standing at his door alone, with then walking in the hallway alone, and then leaving the house alone to walk a block away. And the goal was to eventually be in the park surrounded by people for a few hours with the phone in hand, so that all these exposures would happen during our telehealth sessions. And eventually we thought about also when I could meet him in the community to go to other places even farther and more unfamiliar together. So that's what ended up happening with Cisco.
And again, Dan, I think it's a good example of that in some ways, actually, something that you would think would be a problem, right? Reinforcing that in-home and social isolation and withdrawal, actually, telehealth turned into a mechanism to really intervene quite effectively. How did he end up doing with his, sort of getting out into the community?
Well, I left and came here, so I don't know the full full results. But I think he was starting to talk a lot more about, like, what kind of job can I get, given wanting to have my preferences about people, but also knowing I need to leave the house, knowing that my parent can't always leave with me. And he did start engaging in the steps that we tried to carry out in that kind of exposure plan. And of course, with these types of scenarios, as anyone knows, there's always going to be challenges to taking that first step versus the next step and then the next step. But we certainly were able to be off to a great start.
Yeah.
By
Well,
the
and it
time I
sounds
left.
at the very least, though, the interventions did, result in, at least short term, those steps, that exposure, little by little, and you were able to see those and experience those with him. That's amazing. So thank you for sharing those. We're gonna turn to questions and answers. So we've had a few come in during the talk. Again, going back to some of a question that came up earlier, engagement at the beginning of telehealth. Nicole or Dan, can either of you respond? What are your thoughts about what are the best ways to engage at the beginning of telehealth? That was a question from Emma that came up earlier.
I mean, for me, I'm always thinking about, well, what are their own wellness resources? What's the gold that I can really find out about them regarding hobbies, interests? Maybe it's talking about things in a way that doesn't make it just about quote unquote therapy, finding something that can really connect, whether that's watching a music video together, listening to music together. I colored on telehealth with someone. There's so many different ways to think about how to be creative and engaged. And I think it really does start with, hey, what is the individual's definition of wellness, definition of recovery, definition of what this space is supposed to lead to, and then really going from there, and also understanding, well, what is the family's role in also supporting or inhibiting engagement, and also especially working with the family to help support that process.
Nicole, any thoughts about that beginning engagement and what that entails, or what we need to be doing?
Yeah, I love Dan's thoughts. I love the creativity. I think there's so much room for creativity in person. And I think it was a little overwhelming when telehealth was sort of forced upon us during the pandemic of like, well, how do we do all of that we did there in person virtually? And I think thanks to technology, there's actually a lot we can do, via different kinds of platforms, different virtual games, virtual art making. And I think finding, again, leading with that individual, that child's or adolescent's interests, and what is their understanding around why they're there, and how to also make that into just a human to human relationship. Yeah, it's through a screen, but you're talking to another human there, and what drives them, what motivates them, what excites them, and what are they there to accomplish. And so finding creative ways that it's not just, right, like Dan said, not just, doesn't just feel like therapy, but like is dynamic and interactive, and it's led by them and what
Right.
their interests are.
Yeah, and I'm glad you emphasized that, because I think, you know, that it's a little bit of a balance. On the one hand, you do have to possibly do things some differently than you would in person. And at the same time, I appreciate your thought, Nicole. It is still human to human contact, even though it's through a screen. It may seem different, and there may be things that you can do differently than you would if you were in person. But at the end of the day, yes, that human to human interpersonal contact is so critical, and the benefit of that is always there.
I also will say that, you know, sometimes when we think about mental health service delivery, we have these kind of preconceived notions about what they're supposed to look like. And there's really honestly no one but youth who can really help us challenge that, that preconceived notion of what we're supposed to do. And telehealth can also further that challenge depending on what is our own comfort level, what is our skill level. And when we encounter these barriers to great engagement, that challenge is communicating to us, like, what am I supposed to pivot to? How do I increase my proficiency and skill level to really, really think about how I'm able to promote engagement with the youth and with the family, to really think about how it's not just on the youth and the family, that we also want to think about the changes we can make in our own practice.
Right. Thanks, Dan. Now, this was a very specific question. Barbara was also concerned or thinking about a common occurrence, which is, you know, young adults or children that do not have a camera. And I believe also may be concerned about being on camera. So what suggestions do you have to address this, and of addressing it, having the camera on, but also without making young people feel defensive? So how do you handle that if someone is either does not have a camera or doesn't want to be on camera? I hope I got that right, Barbara.
Right, I can jump in there. And I think those are two different things to assess and explore. I think the resource or access to resources, like not having a camera, like maybe that takes some advocacy or some, you know, help with securing those kinds of resources or that technology. But the behavior of having the camera off is something different clinically in terms of how they're engaging and how they feel and comfort level being on camera. I know in the height of the pandemic, even up until now, you know, just the exhaustion of being on screen, there's something very different we don't even understand that happens when you're just on a screen and seeing yourself back at you and engaging that way. So, you know, there's the fatigue of being on video and like that awareness. Okay, Barbara, got you. Yeah, so more about not wanting the camera on. So I think that behavior, just like, I mean, it makes me think about having sessions with some young people who didn't want to speak, right? We sat in silence. And how do we kind of acknowledge that and name it, hold space for it, and keep moving and keep kind of working together and make it safe and make it okay for them to behave that way and help them connect about where that behavior might be coming from. Is it, you know, and without it being right to your point about not being defensive about it, but naming it, like, I noticed your camera's off. I'm wondering if, you know, it might be hard to talk about this and think about me seeing you or you seeing yourself. And there may be even like maybe you don't, there's like that feature on Zoom too, where you can turn off your self view, which was not there in the height of the pandemic. That was a new update for Zoom. So, but I think naming it and exploring it clinically, like you would any other kind of behavior, and what is it serving? What is it doing for them in the work? I'm curious Dan's thoughts too, though.
Yeah, but I really appreciate those thoughts, though, because I think that they bring into sort of into the discussion that those clinical determinations that I really love your connecting that to what you do when kids aren't very communicative or they're silent. Or wonderful connection. Dan?
Yes, you know, I think one of the things that's really interesting to also think about is who actually thrives being in front of the camera, and how can people actually become so comfortable actually being on screen all the time, because our assumption is already that it is more uncomfortable or more tiresome. And in fact, there's such diversity of experiences that some people are actually doing a lot better or more engaged in front of the camera than in person. And there's, of course, clinical reasons for us to think about why that is the case, but we've all been socialized in a way to really consider the in-person interaction as different than the on-camera interaction. And that is something for us to really think about with regards to our own relationship to it. That being said, I always think about what is the kind of reason for being on camera and why we want to have people on camera, and what is the understanding of the youth for why they need to be on camera. There's something about being seen for us to really think about that might be really important for the youth to understand, and maybe they don't want to share it at the time, but it becomes this kind of negotiation about all these different options that could be done, and what does it mean for being on camera to promote the personal things that they want to achieve out of your therapeutic relationship with them. And so I think about MI, motivational interviewing, thinking about dancing with Discord, thinking about how to involve family members. I'm also thinking about what does it look like for them to consider other options if they don't want to be on camera on telehealth. For example, some people are motivated by not coming in person. And then I'm like, oh, okay, that was the easiest thing. All I had to say was like, oh, so like maybe some of the options is going me to visit you, for me to see you in the office. And they're like, no, let's just stay here. I'll turn my camera on. And even something like that, as basic as that, and opening up the options and helping them think things through. Because when we think about youth and teenagers and young adults, sometimes thinking it through in that way doesn't even cross their minds. And we have to help with expanding it as they help expand what we want to think about.
Dan, wonderful use of the paradoxical intervention. See, even on telehealth, you can use it. Wonderful. So unfortunately, I know we're so close to time. I know there were a couple of more questions here around engaging. So and they were generally around engaging. So I hope some of the responses that Dan and Nicole gave to the earlier questions help to answer those questions around engaging young folks in telehealth. But in the interest of time, we just have a couple of things we did want to sort of go here because again, oh, sorry, these are our references, but to go here to some resources, we wanted to mention a couple of things about resources that are available. So going back, as we think about telehealth and its utility for delivering behavioral health services to young people in families, I hope we've been able to sort of identify that it is a tool that can be used and it has to be used mindfully. And there are many different considerations. So there's no one way or another to do it. However, what we also want to make sure is that for those who can benefit, that they do have the availability of the tools, the software and the hardware to be able to engage in telehealth when that is appropriate. So these are some ways in which you can access these resources that can help connect people or get people connected, I should say. And a couple of things just as a reminder is that, as programs, we're going to put these links into the chat so that you can have access to those links as well and look them up. As we mentioned, these slides will be available in the next couple of days, so you can access these links when you get the slides. But a couple of important points about this is, to do the research and to try to sort of track down and see and provide information to the families, the children, youth, and families that you work with around how to access these. There are eligibility requirements for these programs. So those will have to be thought through as well. But the important thing here is to make sure, again, that for those folks who can benefit from it, that there obviously be the hardware and software available for them to do that. Dan and Nicole, any final thoughts about that? Super quick thoughts about these?
Use them. That's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, and I know, sorry about not leaving enough time for that, but so you'll have these available to look. Please, as we mentioned before, please complete the survey, including any suggestions you have for future topics or more discussions like this in the future. I want to thank a couple of things about our upcoming events. These are some events that are happening in the near future: sensory integration meets emotional regulation, looking at neurodiversity in therapy, mental health moment, a conversation about intergenerational trauma with Galit Atlas, and then ACEs awareness. We're going to be doing a series of events for ACEs awareness day in April. So please be on the lookout for those and join us for those discussions about ACEs awareness. I want to thank you all for participating. I want to thank Nicole and Dan for an amazing discussion today. I hope you all benefited from it. Please visit the CTAC website for any of our other offerings. And again, as I said, in a couple of days, the recording and the slides from this presentation, as well as additional resources, will be available on our website. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.